wanted to talk to you today about how to select multi-factor tokens for a sensitive enclave or an enterprise if the organization is treating their entire enterprise as capable of holding CUI. So specifically, I'm not talking about multi-factor tokens if you have your HR department, your public relations department not connected to sensitive data. So just to set the stage there. So if a customer of mine, let's say a government contractor, approached me about MFA for their sensitive environment and asked me what type of tokens would be acceptable, I would probably say FIPS 140-2 validated tokens or smart cards. And someone might jump and say, oh my gosh, why are you jumping to such an expensive technology, such complicated technology, without going through the analysis? Well, it's based on a lot of experience in NIST 153 and a lot of architecture experience. But let's go through the documentation on this video. So first, and I'm talking about maturity level 3, right? So first, let's go to IA.3.083 is our practice that's referencing multi-factor authentication. And the requirements are to use MFA for local and network access to privileged accounts, and to use MFA for network access to non-privileged accounts. And then if we get into the discussion is a really key part of the assessment guide. And it talks about what multi-factor authentication is. And it says something you know, something you have, and something, or something you are, right, in the case of biometric. So where does this come from, right? And at the end of the discussion section, there is a reference to NIST 800-63-3. And if you look at that section, 4.3.1, you'll see that the discussion of an authenticator is basically taken verbatim from this NIST 800-63-3 guide and put into, to populate this section of the discussion. It was originally taken from NIST 171. With one small exception, right? They added a comma token as an example of something you have. So you might think, well, what about SMS tokens, right? What about a time-based SMS token? Is that an opening to use those? Well, let's continue through the analysis and let's see. So now, if we go to section 6, it gets into this area of selecting an assurance level, or AAL. And you'll see one of the questions for the risk analysis is, are you trying to mitigate the release of sensitive data? And of course, if we're targeting an ML3 assessment, we are, right? We're trying to protect CUI data and potentially FCI. So that table establishes that the minimum assurance level for mitigating the release of sensitive data is AL2. And figure 6-2 walks you through the flow chart for how to go through the risk analysis, right? And one of the questions is, are you trying to protect sensitive data? And if you answer yes, then you're immediately taken to AAL level 2. So AL level 2 is acceptable, AAL level 3 is acceptable. So the organization has to decide what level of risk their sensitive data is, whether it is low, medium, and then would map you to the AL2, or it's high risk and map you to AL3. So some considerations might be, well, what type of CUI do you have, right? How much do you have? What is the mission impact on the organization if that data is compromised? For example, do you have the more restricted versions of CUI? Do you have a small amount of kind of low value CUI? And so then, let's say an organization decides that they have low, medium risk data, and therefore they think this maps to AL2. So there is the potential in AL2 to use SMS messages as the second factor if you have a memorized token, so a password, right, plus the SMS token as the second factor. But the big caveat here is that the SMS messages via the public switch telephone network is a restricted authenticator. And the definition of restricted, you'll see on the screen, has a bunch of requirements. And that is, you have to warn the user that they're using a less secure method of authentication and offer them an alternative. So, and offer them a non-restricted alternative. So, if you're going to do that, in my view, why even bother offering the restricted the SMS? Just use the other thing, right? Don't offer them restricted the SMS and the other thing. Just offer them the other thing. But let's say you're really curious to kind of push this SMS issue. So if you look at the requirements for out-of-band authentication, you'll see that there's a specific section, because it's restricted, on the public switch telephone network, and there are all of these requirements. So in addition to warning the user, offering them an alternative, you also have to do other things. And those other things are validating the level of entropy that's used in the token codes, validating the replay resistance of the token, right? So how is there a timeout there, and is that method replay resistant in the provider? So you're going to have to look at how the provider implements this and look in their very detailed controls and understand how they're doing that if they're willing to share that with you. And so to me, NIST is very much trying to discourage people from using SMS, but there is this kind of narrow, complex pathway if you really want to do it. So I think the bottom line is just don't use SMS, right? It's being discouraged, and there's all this work that you have to do. You have to make sure that the users are receiving SMS codes on a device and not a VoIP, right? That's actually tied to a physical device, and that you have processes and procedures in place if they change the telephone that number is associated with, and it doesn't get associated, transferred to somebody else. So lots of complexity there, right? So, as I noted before, this only applies, right, if you're AAL level 2. So, arguably in AAL 2, you don't need FIPS, validated cryptography. There's a note there that the government needs it, right, but an organization doesn't. So, now in AAL 3, you notice that the government note is removed, right? It just says FIPS validated cryptography for everyone, basically, to get AAL 3. So you might think, well, then this is great. We don't have to use FIPS validated cryptography because it's technically not required in AML 2. But there are other controls, depending on the interpretation, right, that may require this, right? So protecting the confidentiality of CUI requires FIPS, right? Well, if the person who's authenticating is an administrator that has access to assign rights to CUI, there's obviously an potential interpretation there that, well, you're protecting CUI because the person who's logging in either has access to the CUI or they can assign access because they're an administrator. So, as interpretations, you see how that plays out. That could arguably require FIPS 140-2 for your authentication. So, what are we doing? We are using FIPS 140-2 validated hardware time-based token for our second factor. I think it's just easier not to go down the rabbit hole of, well, are we low, medium, or high risk? And how does this interact with the other controls? Since the people logging in have access or will have access to CUI or control access to CUI. And it's easier just to use FIPS validated cryptography and not have this as a potential concern with the auditors. If you have questions about implementing FIPS 140-2 validated tokens or multi-factor authentication in your environment and integrating those with various tools such as network devices, cloud providers, etc., feel free to reach out to us to discuss what you're looking for and how we can help you achieve your goals.